The air in the clearing was a shroud, cold and heavy with the scent of pine and finality. Around the body of Burhan Sahib, the world had shrunk to the space between one breath and the next. Jakata Sahib knelt, his knuckles white where he gripped the earth. The silence was his enemy, a void where his brother's voice should have been. He reached out a trembling hand, laying Burhan's own sword across his chest, the cold steel a final, terrible blanket. His voice was a rasp of shattered stone. Burhan, my brother, my confidant, my shadow in life. First Osman Sahib and now you. How is Jarkata's heart to bear this? How Burhan? A tear carved a path through the grime on his cheek, falling onto the polished steel. Burhan Sahib stepped forward, his shadow falling over both the living and the dead. He placed a hand on Jarkata's heaving shoulder, the grip firm, a tether to the world of the living. You will bear it, Jarkata Sahib. We will bear it. A wolf hides its wound until the moment of its vengeance. We will hide our wounds. We will carve our revenge into the faces of the traitors, a sound so loud it will echo in their souls. The fire returned to Jarkata's eyes, burning through the grief. He looked up at Orhan, his face a mask of iron resolve. My brother's blood will not stain this ground for nothing, my Sultan. Let them run. What good will it do them? Every rebel who drew breath for this scheme will pay the price. I will hunt them down, one by one. Hidden in the deep, inky blackness beyond the firelight, Shahanshah watched, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Beside him, Damir Khan and Mahmud were still as statues, drinking in the scene of sorrow. They believed they were the wolves watching the wounded deer. They could not hear the sharpening of fangs within the circle of grief. Orhan's gaze swept the oppressive darkness of the surrounding woods. They have not run, Jarkata Sahib, he said, his voice low but carrying with lethal clarity. They are here. At his words, his Alps, his warriors spun around, swords half drawn, their eyes piercing the shadows. A rustle of leaves, a snapped twig. In the distance, Shahanshah and his commanders recoiled, melting back into the deeper gloom. They had been seen. The prey knew the hunter was near. Tamir Boga, his face etched with impatience, knelt beside Orhan. Then what do we wait for, my Sultan? Let us attack. Orhan looked not at the darkness, but into the heart of the fire, as if divining the future in its flames. They are waiting for our sorrow to break us. They wait for us to scatter. They wish to hunt us one by one like frightened rabbits. A grizzled captain named Mustafa spat on the ground. It is the only way jackals know how to hunt, my Sultan. Jarkata rose to his feet, his hand now resting on the hilt of his own sword. The only thing that gives me strength now is the thought of spilling the blood of these cowards. Tell us what we are to do, my Sultan. Give the order. Orhan's eyes met his, then swept over every man gathered. We will remain united. We will wait for their attack. Let those who claim to be men of courage face us on the field of battle, not from the shadows. Insha'Allah, Jarkata vowed, his voice a low growl. Orhan Sahib stood tall, a pillar of resolve amidst a sea of simmering rage. The trap was set. But who was the hunter and who was the hunted? In the shadows, Mahmud whispered to Shahanshah, his voice laced with unease. Do you think they have left? The clearing is quiet. Shahanshah's laugh was a dry, grating sound. It matters not what they do now, Mahmud Sahib. There is no escape for them from the death that awaits. No escape from the anger that is building inside me like a glacier of ice. They are trapped. Damir Khan nodded, his hand resting on the pommel of his blade. The Kechik warriors have arrived. They are sealing every path. Soon this entire forest will be swarming with our men, circling this clearing like vultures. From the deepest part of the shadow, a voice, slick with venom, spoke. It was Yaqid, the traitor, the serpent in their midst. Their corpses will be food for the crows and the wolves. Just a little more patience. He watched the firelight, his face unreadable, but a darkness swirled in his eyes that had nothing to do with the night. He was watching the men he once called brothers, and he was sealing their doom. Far from that clearing of death, another fate was unfolding. In the sprawling, moon-drenched forest, Princess Aspolka rode hard, the wind whipping her hair, the rhythmic thunder of hooves a desperate prayer. She urged the horse on, faster, ever faster, as if she could outrun the turmoil in her heart, the palace walls, the face of the man she had married. Then, slithering across the path, a dark ribbon of movement in the moonlight, a snake. The horse reared with a terrified scream, its iron-shod hoofs striking sparks from the stones. Asporka was thrown, a cry torn from her lips as she hit the hard, unforgiving earth. Darkness swallowed her. Meanwhile, Fatima Khatun, a storm of determination in her eyes, had reached the horse trader's stall at the edge of the territories. The man was sweating, though the night was cool. By Allah, I helped no one. I am a simple man trying to earn my bread. Fatima's voice was sharp as a dagger's point. Stop the lies. You are the only one who sells horses of this quality for miles. Did you or did you not sell a steed to a woman with Roman features? The man's resolve crumbled. He fumbled in a pouch and poured its contents into his palm. A necklace, a ring, and jeweled hairpins glinted in the lantern light. She had no coins, she gave me these. Fatima took them. The crest, the craftsmanship, it was Asportka. The proof was cold and heavy in her hand. Her heart sank. How long since she left? The sun had not yet reached its peak, the man stammered. Fatima turned to her guards. Give him the coin for the horse. We ride now. We have wasted enough time. Let's go. Her men tossed a heavy purse to the trader and mounted, their faces grim. The hunt was on. Back in the palace, the air was thick with tension. Malhoun Khatun's voice cracked like a whip in the women's quarters, directed at a trembling lady-in-waiting named Erez. How could Asporka leave this palace? How did you not see her? How did you not hear her? Erez bowed her head low. By Allah, Malhoun Khatun, she ordered us to our duties. When we returned, she was gone. Gone? Malhoun's voice rose, laced with fury and disbelief. With guards at every door and soldiers on every wall, she made a fool of you. You are all fools. In a corner, a young man named Suleiman gave a subtle nod to Qasim, who then escorted a nervous-looking woman, Gulsum, from the room. The web of intrigue had many threads. Gonka, her face pale, tried to soothe her mother. Mother, who could have known she would do such a thing in her state. Nilufer, however, saw opportunity in the chaos. Her words were honeyed but dripped with poison. Our Sultan is striving for conquests. Halem is away on her duties. Fatima has risked her life to chase after her. We struggle here to hold everything together, and yet we must deal with Asporka's childishness at such a time. Malhoun turned her fiery gaze on Nilufer. I am thinking of everyone's safety, including Asporka's. Asporka came to this palace as a bride to secure the future of two states, Nilufer retorted, her voice hardening. She should have sat and thought of her duty, mother. Instead, she thought only of herself. You have never restrained your tongue, not on any occasion, Malhoun snapped. What am I to do with you? Gonka, ever the loyal sister to Nilufer, chimed in. No one has said anything that is not true, mother. Was Asporka so kind? If she were truly kind and friendly, she would be with us now, not running like a thief in the night. Malhoun's patience finally broke. I have warned you many times. You too have made this palace unbearable for that woman, and her father's situation only made it worse. Is this what you wanted, Nilufer? Is it? If she did not have the strength to carry the burden asked of her, she should not have stepped forward, Nilufer said unrepentant. She claimed she was coming to save two states. She was thinking of nothing but herself and her father. Now everyone can see it. Enough, Nilufer. Enough, Malhoun's voice thundered. Asporka is the Sultan's wife. Accept this fact. She turned to Gonka. You too, Gonka. This is my final warning to you both. As the words hung in the air, a sharp gasp came from Gonka. She clutched her side, her face twisting in pain. Gonka? Gonka, are you well? Malhoun rushed to her side, her anger instantly replaced by maternal fear. The other women helped Gonka to a divan. Bring sherbet, quickly! Malhoun commanded, cradling her daughter's head. Oh, my daughter, you must rest. Nilufer knelt beside her sister, a flicker of genuine concern in her eyes. Just a little while longer, my sister. Just a little while longer. The night deepened over the forest clearing. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows. Orhan Sahib stood before his men, his voice no longer a whisper but a resonant call to arms that pushed back the darkness. My bays, my alts, I know your hearts are burning, but know this. The fire inside me is 1,000 times greater than yours. You have lost a bay, but I have lost a legacy of my father and his brother in arms. You have lost a commander, but I have lost the one who taught me what it means to command. But we will not fall, we will never break. In one heart, we will keep 1,000 Burhans alive. With their faith, with their honor, we will fight from one Gaza to the next. We will be companions to those who walk his path. And we will become the divine punishment for those who inflicted this agony upon us. He extended his arm towards Jakarta. With a roar of renewed purpose, Jakarta grasped Orhan's forearm and allowed himself to be pulled to his feet, his grief forged into a weapon. At that very moment, in the traitor's hiding place, a scout scurried to Damir Khan. Damir Khan Sahib, the Kechik warriors have drawn their swords. They hold every corner. A triumphant, predatory gleam lit Damir Khan's eyes. He looked at Shahanshah. The time has come, my bays. Bismillah! They moved as one, stepping from the darkness into the firelight, their trap ready to spring. Only Yakid hesitated for a heartbeat, a phantom of doubt crossing his face before he followed them into the light. Back in the circle of warriors, Orhan turned to one of his captains, a young man named Shamal. Where is Evrenos Saheb? Where is Faladios? Shamal's face was grim. He said he would try to break out and get word to our allies, my Sultan, but something may have happened to him. Before the thought could settle, the night erupted. Move, quickly! Do not stop! Surround them! The shouts came from all sides, a chorus of doom. Orhan's Alps formed a tight circle, their backs to each other, their swords a hedge of glittering steel. These are the sounds, Orhan called out, his voice calm amidst the chaos, the sounds of the snakes who have crept into our midst. From the trees they poured a flood of enemy soldiers, their armor glinting. They formed a ring of death around Orhan and his handful of warriors. And then, leading them, stepping into the clearing with smug arrogance, came Shahanshah, Damir Khan and Mahmud. Shahanshah's mocking voice cut through the tension. What happened, Orhan? Have you swallowed your tongue? Ah, Jarkata, our presence has not frightened you, has it? Jarkata's reply was a low, murderous snarl. Shahanshah, you jackal in a wolf's skin, you killed my brother. I will tear you to pieces. Do not worry, Jarkata, Shahanshah sneered. I will send you to your brother soon enough. Orhan Sahib raised his sword, its tip pointing at the heavens. You heedless fools, you have martyred a great Ghazi of the Osmanli. For this your blood will flow here like a river. You are dreaming, Orhan, Damir Khan shouted, gesturing to the hundreds of warriors surrounding them. You are dreaming. Look around you. You are surrounded by the Kechiks, whose lands you tried to seize. You will not leave this place alive. Then a Kechik commander, a man with a face like carved oak, stepped forward. He looked directly at Orhan. You tried to conquer Chanali, Sultan Orhan, but you have no need, for Chanali is already with you. And with a great cry, he swung his sword not at Orhan, but pointing it directly at Shahanshah. The world seemed to stop. Shahanshah, Damir Khan and Mahmud stared in utter disbelief. And then, as if by a single unspoken command, every Kechik warrior turned. Their swords, which had been a ring of death pointed inward, were now a ring of death pointed outward at Shahanshah's own men. The ground fell away beneath Shahanshah's feet. He stammered, his face pale with dawning horror. What? What is this man saying, Damir Khan Sahib? Traitor! Damir Khan roared, his face purple with rage. Filthy traitor! And from the edge of the forest a figure emerged, calm and resolute. It was Burhan Faladios Evano Sahib, his sword held ready. The brave sons of the Kechik, he announced, his voice ringing with authority, stand with the Ottomans until their last drop of blood, Sultan Orhan. Orhan smiled, a grim, terrifying smile. Yes, now speak, Damir Khan Sahib, tell me again, who will not leave this place alive? For a moment there was only the sound of the crackling fire and Damir Khan's ragged breathing. Then his face twisted into a mask of pure fury. He screamed the only words left to him. Attack! Attack! It was not an ambush anymore. It was a maelstrom. The Kechiks and Orhan's Alps crashed into Shahanshah's forces like a tidal wave of steel and vengeance. The first to charge was Torhan, Orhan's right hand, a whirlwind of motion. An arrow flew at Orhan's chest. Torhan's sword flashed, a silver blur in the torchlight, and the arrow was cut from the air. He roared and plunged into the enemy ranks, carving a path for his sultan. Orhan followed, his blade a legacy of his father's fury. He moved not with the wildness of Jarkata, but with a cold, focused lethality. Every movement was precise, every strike fatal. He sought Damir Khan, the architect of this betrayal. But another duel was far more personal. Across the churning battlefield, Burhan Faladios saw him. Yaqid, the traitor. Their eyes locked, and the chaos of the battle around them faded to a dull roar. There were no words. There was only a history of shared campaigns, of broken bread, of trust now shattered into a million pieces. Faladios advanced, his steps measured, his sword held low. Yaqid, for his part, met the advance, his style defensive, parrying, always retreating a step. He was fighting not just Faladios, but his own conscience. Jarkata was a force of nature. He was not fighting with skill, but with pure, unadulterated grief. His roars were cries of anguish, and his sword rose and fell again and again, each blow for his fallen brother. He took a cut to his arm, but did not seem to notice, his eyes fixed on the banner of Shahanshah's personal guard. He would cut his way to the serpent himself. The tide of battle turned swiftly. Men like Abdul Rahman and Tamir Buga fought back to back, a bastion of loyalty. On the left flank, Altadin Sahib fell, his chest pierced by a spear, but his captain Kilal was there, avenging him with two swift strokes that felled the spearman and the man beside him. Mustafa and Aluddin Sahib pushed the enemy line back, their shouts of Allah, a thunderous refrain. Mahmud, seeing his flank collapsing, tried to rally his men. Stand firm for the Shahanshah, stand and fight. But his voice was lost in the screams and the clash of steel. His men were terrified, caught between the vengeful Alps and the Kechiks they had thought were their allies. They began to break, to run, their discipline dissolving into panic. Shahanshah watched the massacre, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only raw primal fear. He was no warrior. He was a schemer, a talker, and his schemes had turned to ash in his mouth. He looked for an escape, but he was encircled. Jarkata, his face and arms slick with blood, was cutting through the last of his guards. Orhan was locked in a furious exchange with Damir Khan, sparks flying as their swords met. Faladios had disarmed Yakid, the traitor's sword spinning into the darkness. Faladios' blade was at Yakid's throat. Damir Khan, realizing all was lost, tried a desperate gambit. He feigned a stumble, then lunged not at Orhan but past him, trying to break through the line and flee into the woods. But Turhan, ever watchful, materialized from the chaos, his shield slamming into Damir Khan's side, sending him sprawling to the ground. In an instant, the swords of Kulads and Zarkhan were at his neck. It was over. The fighting died down, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of the victorious. The clearing was a charnel house, the ground soaked with the blood of traitors. Orhan stood over the defeated Damir Khan, his chest heaving. "You sought to drown us in our own blood," Orhan said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now you will drown in your own shame." Jarkata finally reached Shahanshah, who had dropped his ornamental dagger and stood trembling. Jarkata raised his blood sword, the image of his dead brother flashing in his mind. But Orhan's voice stopped him. "No, Jarkata, not like this. His fate will be a lesson, not a release." Faladios held the point of his sword against Yakid's throat. "Why?" was all he asked. Yakid closed his eyes, a single tear of shame tracing a path down his cheek. He offered no answer. There was none that would suffice. The victory was absolute, but the cost was etched on every face. They had avenged Burhan, but his body still lay in the center of the clearing, a silent testament to the price of betrayal. As his men began to secure the prisoners and tend to the wounded, Orhan looked up at the moon, a sliver of silver in the dark sky. The war for the soul of the land was not a single battle, but a long, dark road, and deep in that same forest miles away, Aspoka's eyes fluttered open. The world swam back into focus, a dizzying collage of leaves and moonlight. She pushed herself up, her head throbbing, and then she saw him, standing before her as if summoned from a dream. Her father, the Emperor Andronikos. "Asporka, my daughter," he said, his voice full of a sorrow she had never heard. He held out his hand. "Come, let us go." "Baba," she whispered, reaching for him, a child once more. "Baba." She tried to stand, her body aching, but as she did, she glanced behind her. Another figure stood there, bathed in an ethereal light. It was Orhan. "Asporka," he said, his voice not a command but a statement of fact. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known." "Orhan," she breathed, torn between the two figures, the past and the present, duty and a feeling she could not yet name. Orhan held out his own hand. "You can do this," he said, his eyes holding hers. She reached for him, her fingers stretching across the space between them. And then, in a blink, he was gone. She stood alone in the forest, the ghost of her father before her, the memory of her husband behind her, a princess caught between two worlds, lost in the wilderness of her own heart. The battle in the clearing was over, but her war was just beginning.
The night air in the camp of the Kei was thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the unmistakable, metallic tang of fresh blood, a solemn perfume that clung to the heavy cloaks of the warriors who stood in silent, suffocating grief around the fallen body of Boran. The torches flickered, casting long, trembling shadows that danced like restless spirits across the blood-stained soil, illuminating the tear-streaked face of Jarkata Sahib, who knelt beside his fallen brother in arms, his broad shoulders shaking with the silent, tectonic tremors of a heart breaking under the weight of an unbearable loss. Jarkata's calloused hands, hands that had wielded the sword of justice and struck down the enemies of the state with merciless precision, now trembled as they gently laid Boran's own blade across the chest of the martyr, the steel cold and unforgiving against the stillness of death. He leaned closer, his voice a ragged, broken whisper that cut through the stillness of the night, calling out to the soul that had already departed, mourning not just a warrior, but a piece of his own spirit, lamenting that first the great Osman Sahib had ascended to the heavens, and now Boran, his steadfast companion, his brother in the sacred struggle, had followed, leaving Jarkata to wonder how a heart forged in the fires of war could possibly endure such relentless, hollowing sorrow. The tears that fell from Jarkata's eyes were not merely water, but the distilled essence of a lifelong brotherhood, dropping onto the armor of the fallen, each tear a silent oath, each sob a testament to a bond that death itself could not sever. Standing above him, his face a mask of carved stone illuminated by the dying embers of the campfire, Orhan Sahib watched his commander's grief with eyes that burned with 1,000 unshed tears, a fire of sorrow and righteous fury warring within his chest. Orhan stepped forward, the soft crunch of his boots on the gravel sounding like the tolling of a distant bell, and placed a firm, steadying hand upon Jarkata's trembling shoulder, his voice low, resonant, and carrying the undeniable weight of a sovereign who bore the grief of his entire nation upon his own soul. He spoke to Jarkata not just as a commander, but as a brother, telling him that they would endure, that they must endure, for the wolf does not howl its pain to the world when it is wounded. It hides its injuries in the shadows, it licks its wounds in the darkness, and it waits with infinite, terrifying patience until the moment is right to exact a vengeance so absolute that the earth itself will tremble. Orhan's words were a balm and a battle cry intertwined, promising that they would hide their wounds, that they would swallow their grief, and that they would unleash the roaring, deafening thunder of their retribution upon the faces of the traitors who had dared to spill the blood of the innocent. Jarkata looked up, his eyes red and feral, reflecting the firelight like the eyes of a cornered beast, and swore by the Almighty that his brother's blood would not be left to soak uselessly into the dirt, that even if the cowards who struck him down fled to the very edges of the earth, they would be hunted, that every rebel, every conspirator, every shadow that had aided in this treachery would pay the price, and that he would carve his vengeance into their very bones, one by one, until the scales of justice were balanced in blood. Unbeknownst to the mourning warriors, the darkness of the surrounding forest was not empty, for hidden within the dense thicket of ancient pines, cloaked by the shadows and the rustling leaves, Shahanshah, Damir Khan, and Mahmud crouched in the damp underbrush, their eyes fixed upon the camp, listening to the vows of vengeance with a mixture of apprehension and arrogant triumph. They watched the grief of the Kay, misinterpreting the solemn stillness for weakness, believing that the death of Boran had broken the spine of Orhan's army. But Orhan Sahib, whose instincts were as sharp as the edge of a freshly whetted killage, suddenly shifted his gaze toward the tree line, his eyes piercing the gloom with a predator's intuition, and he spoke loudly enough for the hidden spies to hear, telling Jarkata that the cowards had not fled, that they were still here, lurking in the dark like the scavengers they were. The sudden, piercing direction of Orhan's gaze sent a jolt of primal fear through the hidden commanders. Shahanshah, Damir Khan, and Mahmud instinctively recoiled, melting deeper into the shadows, their breath catching in their throats as they realized they were not the hunters, but the observed, and they slowly, silently retreated into the abyss of the forest, leaving only the rustling of leaves in their wake. Back in the center of the camp, Tamir Boga, his face smeared with the dust and sweat of the day's skirmishes, knelt beside Orhan, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, and asked his sultan when they would strike, when they would unleash the fury that was boiling within their veins. Orhan's response was measured, cold, and calculated, explaining that the enemy was waiting for the Kay to scatter in their grief, waiting for the blind rage of morning to break their formation, so they could be picked off one by one like isolated prey. Shamal, standing nearby with his arms crossed over his chest, spat into the dirt, muttering that such cowardly tactics were the only path known to jackals who lacked the courage to face a lion in the open. Jarkata, rising to his feet, his grief now fully transmuted into a cold, lethal resolve, declared that the only thing keeping him standing was the thought of the blood of these cowards soaking his blade, and he demanded to know the plan, his voice trembling with the need for violence. Orhan looked at his commanders, his eyes sweeping over the battle-hardened faces of Abdul Rahman, Zarkin, Kulads, and Kilil, and declared that they would remain united, an unbreakable wall of iron and faith, and they would wait for the enemy to make their move. For those who claimed to be men would be forced to face them on the battlefield, where the sword would be the only judge and the only jury. Jarkata nodded, whispering a fervent prayer to the Almighty, and as Orhan rose to his full height, the camp seemed to stand a little taller, the despair of the night giving way to the grim, unyielding promise of the coming dawn. Deep in the forest, far from the strategic whispers of the camp, Shahanshah paced like a caged tiger, his mind racing with the intoxicating, dangerous illusion of impending victory. Mahmud, ever the sycophant, approached him with a sly smile, asking if he believed the Kei had been truly broken by the loss of their commander. Shahanshah stopped, his face twisting into a mask of cruel satisfaction, and replied that it no longer mattered what the Kei did, for the death that awaited them was inescapable, and the anger that was growing within his own chest like a massive, unstoppable avalanche would soon bury them all beneath its crushing weight. Damir Khan, his armor clinking softly as he shifted his weight, added with a dark chuckle that the Ketchik mercenaries had already been mobilized, that they were moving through the night to surround the valley, and that by the time the sun crested the mountains, the Kei would be trapped in an inescapable ring of steel. Yakid, the traitor whose very presence was a stain upon the honor of the land, stepped forward from the shadows, his eyes gleaming with a malicious, venomous light, and whispered that soon the corpses of the Kei would be nothing more than a feast for the crows and the wolves, urging them to simply wait and watch the slaughter. But fate, as it always does, weaves its tapestry with threads unseen by the arrogant, and while the conspirators plotted in the dark, a different drama was unfolding beneath the canopy of the ancient woods. Princess Esportia, her heart pounding with a frantic, desperate rhythm, spurred her horse forward, tearing through the dense undergrowth, the branches whipping against her cloak as she fled from the suffocating walls of the palace, driven by a storm of emotions she could no longer contain. She rode as if the hounds of hell were at her heels, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps, the wind tearing at her hair, until suddenly a thick, dark serpent slithered across the narrow, moonlit path. The horse, a creature of instinct and sudden terror, reared violently, its hooves striking the empty air, a high-pitched whinny shattering the silence of the forest. Esportia, caught off guard, lost her grip on the leather reins, and was thrown forcefully from the saddle, her body tumbling through the air before striking the hard, unforgiving earth with a sickening thud. The world spun into a vortex of darkness, the sounds of the forest fading into a dull, distant roar, and she lay motionless among the fallen leaves, swallowed by the deep, dreamless void of unconsciousness. Miles away, in the bustling, lantern-lit market that lay on the outskirts of the territory, Fatima Hatton stood like a vengeful spirit before the trembling horse merchant, her eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated fury. The merchant, a man whose greed was only matched by his cowardice, stammered and sweated beneath her piercing gaze, swearing by his life that he had not aided in any treason, that he was merely a simple man trying to earn his daily bread in a world of wolves. Fatima's voice was like cracking ice as she ordered him to cease his lies, reminding him that he was the only seller of fine steeds in the vicinity, and demanding to know if he had sold a horse to the Roman woman. The merchant, realizing that denial would only lead to his immediate execution, swallowed hard and confessed, explaining that the woman had no coins, and with shaking hands, he reached into his pouch and produced a delicate necklace, a ring, and a pair of ornate earrings, laying them upon the wooden counter. Fatima snatched the jewelry, her fingers tracing the familiar, intricate designs, and in that instant the terrible truth crystallized in her mind. Esportia had indeed fled, stripping herself of her royal adornments to buy her freedom. She demanded to know how long ago the princess had left, and when the merchant replied that the sun had not yet reached its zenith, Fatima's face hardened into a mask of grim determination. She signaled to her guard, ordering him to pay the merchant the full value of the horse in silver coins, for they had no time to waste on the trivialities of commerce when the life of the sultan's wife hung in the balance. Turning on her heel, her cloak billowing behind her like the wings of a dark bird, Fatima marched out into the night, her mind already calculating the routes, the distances, and the dangers that lay ahead, vowing to bring the princess back before the shadows could consume her. Meanwhile, within the high, impenetrable stone walls of the palace, the atmosphere was equally fraught with tension, the air thick with the unspoken accusations and the heavy burden of leadership. Malhan Hatun, the fierce and uncompromising matriarch of the Kei, stood in the center of the grand chamber, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings as she unleashed her wrath upon Iraz Hatun. She demanded to know how a Sportia could have possibly slipped through the heavily guarded gates, how the guards could have been so blind, so deaf, so utterly incompetent as to let the princess vanish into the night. Iraz, bowing her head in shame, stammered that the princess had given them direct orders, that she had commanded them to attend to other duties, and by the time they realized her true intentions, she was already gone. Malhun's eyes flashed with a dangerous light, her voice rising in a crescendo of frustration as she pointed out that the palace was surrounded by seasoned warriors, by watchful eyes and drawn swords, and yet a single woman had made fools of them all. With a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand, she signaled to Suleiman and Gulsum, who immediately bowed and hurried out of the chamber, their footsteps echoing rapidly down the stone corridors as they rushed to join the search. In the corner of the room, Gonka Hatun shifted uncomfortably, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly, and softly suggested that no one could have predicted a Sportia would act so recklessly in her current state of mind. But Nilufer Hatun, whose tongue was as sharp as a Damascus blade and whose heart harbored a deep, lingering resentment, stepped forward, her voice dripping with venomous pragmatism. She reminded them that their sultan was out fighting for the very survival of their state, that Halim was stationed at her post, that Fatima was risking her life in the dark, and yet they were forced to waste their precious time and energy dealing with the selfish whims of a woman who could not bear the weight of her own choices. Malhun turned to her, her expression softening only slightly, stating that her duty was to protect everyone under this roof, including a Sportia. Nilufer scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound, arguing that a Sportia had entered this palace as a bride meant to secure the future of two realms, and if she had possessed even an ounce of foresight, she would have sat quietly and accepted her duty. Malhun's patience, already frayed by the night's events, began to snap, and she warned Nilufer that her constant, biting words had poisoned the well, that she had made the palace an unbearable place for the princess. Gonka, trying to mediate, softly added that if a Sportia had been truly kind and friendly, she would not have fled, but Malhun silenced them both, her voice ringing with absolute authority. She reminded Nilufer that she had warned her time and time again, that the hostility of the women in the palace, combined with the political machinations of a Sportia's father, had driven the princess to this desperate act, and she asked Nilufer if this was the victory she had so desperately sought. Nilufer, unrepentant, lifted her chin and declared that if a Sportia lacked the strength to bear the burden placed upon her, she should never have stepped foot in the Kei lands, that she had claimed to come to save two states, but in truth, she thought only of herself and her father, a fact that was now plain for all to see. Malhun's eyes blazed with a terrifying maternal fury, and she commanded Nilufer to be silent, to accept the undeniable truth that a Sportia was the wife of the Sultan, and that this matter was closed. She then turned her fierce gaze upon Gonka, issuing a final, stern warning to her as well, but before Gonka could reply, a sudden, sharp gasp escaped her lips. Her face drained of color, her hands clutching her abdomen as a wave of intense, blinding pain washed over her. The political squabbles instantly evaporated, replaced by the immediate, visceral reality of life and death. Malhun rushed to her side, her voice suddenly gentle, laced with deep concern, as she and the other women caught Gonka, guiding her to a cushioned divan. Malhun called out urgently for Ike to bring a soothing sherbet, and as the servant girl sprinted from the room, Malhun stroked Gonka's hair, whispering words of comfort telling her to breathe, to rest, while Nilufer, her previous hostility momentarily forgotten in the face of impending motherhood, knelt beside her, whispering that the time was near, that only a little while longer remained until the child would arrive, the tension in the room shifting from the bitter politics of the palace to the sacred, ancient mystery of birth. As the night deepened, wrapping the world in a cloak of impenetrable black, the scene shifted back to the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the valley, where Orhan Sahib stood before the assembled ranks of his Alps, his presence commanding, his silhouette framed by the roaring flames of the campfires. He looked upon the faces of his men, seeing the grief, the anger, and the exhaustion etched into their features, and when he spoke, his voice was a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet. He told his commanders, his brothers, that he knew their hearts were burning with the agony of loss, but he demanded that they understand that the fire raging within his own soul was 1,000 times hotter, 1,000 times more consuming. He reminded them that while they had lost a commander, he had lost the living legacy of his father, he had lost a brother, he had lost the very man who had taught him the sacred art of leadership and the heavy burden of the sword. But he declared, his voice rising, echoing off the canyon walls, they would not fall, they would not break, they would not shatter under the weight of this sorrow. They would keep 1,000 Borns alive within their hearts. They would carry his faith, his honor, and his unyielding spirit into every battle, fighting from one frontier to the next, standing as companions to those who walked the righteous path, and becoming the very wrath of God to those who sought to inflict pain upon the innocent. As he finished speaking, he extended his arm toward Jarkata, who reached out, grasping his sultan's forearm in a warrior's embrace, and pulled himself to his feet, his eyes now dry, his soul hardened into a weapon of pure, unadulterated resolve. Far across the valley, the trap was being set. Mahmud hurried through the damp grass, approaching Damir Khan and Shahanshah with a breathless report, his face flushed with the thrill of impending victory. He informed them that the Kechik mercenaries had taken their positions, that their swords were drawn, and that they had secured every corner of the perimeter, sealing the valley tight. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across Damir Khan's face, and he exchanged a look of dark satisfaction with Shahanshah, declaring that the time had come, that the hour of their triumph was at hand. With a whispered invocation, they signaled the advance, and the massive host of mercenaries and soldiers began to move through the darkness, a silent, deadly tide of steel and leather flowing toward the Kei camp. Yakid remained behind for a moment, watching them go, a sinister smirk playing upon his lips as he anticipated the slaughter, his mind already reveling in the imagined screams of his former brothers. But within the Kei camp, a different realization was dawning. Arhan Sahib turned to Shamal, his brow furrowed in thought, and asked for the whereabouts of Evrenos, known to some as Barhan Faladios. Shamal replied that the fierce commander had said he would attempt to slip through the enemy lines and had vanished into the night, expressing a sudden, gnawing fear that something terrible might have befallen him. Before Arhan could respond, the stillness of the night was shattered by the distant, rhythmic thud of marching boots and the harsh, guttural shouts of commanders ordering their men to close the net, to leave no gaps, to surround the camp completely. The Kei warriors instantly drew their weapons, the ringing of steel echoing through the valley as they formed a tight, defensive circle, their eyes scanning the darkness. Arhan's voice was calm, almost eerily so, as he told his men that these were the sounds of the serpents that had slithered into their midst, and that the time for waiting was over. Suddenly, from all four directions, the tree line erupted with movement, and hundreds of Kechik mercenaries poured into the clearing, their torches illuminating the night, their weapons drawn, completely encircling Arhan, Jarkata, and the Kei Alps. And then, parting the sea of mercenaries like a conquering king, Shahanshah, Damir Khan, and Mahmud rode into the light, their horses snorting in the cold air, their faces masks of arrogant triumph. Shahanshah looked down at Arhan, a mocking, condescending smile on his lips, and asked if the great sultan had swallowed his tongue, if the sudden appearance of an army had frozen the blood in his veins. Jarkata stepped forward, his sword raised, his voice a terrifying growl as he called Shahanshah a jackal hiding in the skin of a wolf, swearing that he would tear him limb from limb for the murder of his brother. Shahanshah merely laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and told Jarkata not to worry, for he would soon be sending him to join his brother in the afterlife. Arhan Sahib, however, did not flinch. His eyes locked onto Shahanshah with a gaze so intense it seemed to burn through the darkness, and he spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who held the favor of the heavens, telling the usurper that he was blind, that he had martyred a great Ghazi of the Almighty, and that tonight his own blood would flow like a river to wash away the sin. Damir Khan sneered, telling Arhan to open his eyes, to look around him, to realize that he was surrounded by the very Kechik forces whose lands he had tried to conquer, and that there was no escape from this ring of death. But the tapestry of fate is woven with threads of irony, and as Damir Khan finished his boast, a single Kechik commander stepped forward from the ranks of the mercenaries. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he stood between the two armies, and then, to the absolute shock of Shahanshah and Damir Khan, he turned his back to Arhan and pointed his sword directly at the conspirators, declaring that Arhan had sought to take their lands, but they had realized that their true enemy was the treacherous snake that sought to use them as pawns, and that the Kechik stood with the Kei. Shahanshah's face drained of color, his arrogant smile vanishing into a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic as he stammered, asking Damir Khan what madness this was. Damir Khan's eyes widened in horror, and he spat the word traitor, but before he could issue a command, the sound of a war horn echoed through the valley, and from the opposite ridge, Barhan Faladios, the fierce and unyielding Evrenos, rode into view at the head of a massive contingent of Kei reinforcements. Faladios drew his sword, the steel gleaming in the firelight, and roared that the brave warriors of the Kechik would stand with the Ottomans until the last drop of their blood was spilled for Sultan Arhan. Arhan Sahib took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes locking onto the terrified face of Damir Khan, and asked him, his voice dripping with cold, lethal irony, who it was that would not be leaving this valley alive. Damir Khan, his mind fracturing under the weight of his collapsed trap, screamed in a voice cracking with desperation, ordering his loyalists to attack, to kill them all, to slaughter every last one of them. The command shattered the tense silence, and instantly the valley erupted into absolute, deafening chaos. The clash of steel against steel rang out like the bells of doom, the screams of men and the shrieks of horses blending into a horrific symphony of war. Tarhan, Arhan's elite right hand, moved like a shadow through the fray, his sword a blur of silver, intercepting arrows meant for his sultan and leading devastating charges that shattered the enemy lines. Mustafa and Altadin Sahib fought back to back, their blades weaving a tapestry of death, while Al-Aliuddin Sahib and Tamir Boga held the flanks, their war cries echoing into the heavens. The earth was quickly slick with blood, the air thick with the dust of battle and the copper scent of slaughter, as the two armies collided with the force of a falling mountain. And while the valley ran red with the blood of warriors, far away in the deep, silent heart of the forest, Princess Esportia slowly opened her eyes, the world swimming into focus through a hazy, dreamlike mist. She pushed herself up from the damp earth, her head throbbing, her breath visible in the cold night air, and as she looked through the fog, a figure materialized before her. It was her father, Andronikos the Shahanshah, his face gentle, his eyes filled with a sorrowful love, reaching out his hand to her, calling her his daughter, telling her to rise, to come away with him, to leave this land of blood and sorrow behind. Esportia's heart ached with a profound, desperate longing, and she whispered his name, reaching out, her fingers trembling as she tried to grasp the hand of the father she had defied, the father she had fled. But as her fingers brushed the empty air, the mist shifted, and the image of her father dissolved, replaced by the towering, steadfast figure of Arhan Sahib. He stood amidst the fog, his armor gleaming, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering strength, and he spoke to her, his voice echoing as if from the bottom of a deep well, telling her that she was the strongest woman he knew, that she possessed a resilience that could weather any storm. Esportia, tears streaming down her face, whispered his name, torn between the ghost of her past and the reality of her present. Arhan extended his hand to her, his palm open, his gaze steady, telling her that she had the power to choose, that she could rise, that she could stand. Esportia slowly raised her hand, her fingers stretching toward his, her heart pounding in her chest, but just as her skin was about to touch his, the wind howled through the pines, the mist swirled violently, and Arhan vanished into the shadows, leaving her alone in the cold, silent forest. She stood there, her hands still outstretched, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and dawning realization, as the distant, faint sound of war horns drifted through the trees, a haunting reminder that the battle for her soul and the battle for the empire was far from over, that the night was still young, and that the blood spilled this day was only the beginning of a storm that would reshape the world forever. The wind howled through the valley like the mournful wail of 1,000 souls departing the earth, carrying with it the acrid stench of burning wood and the metallic tang of freshly spilled blood. And the battlefield that had erupted only moments ago now churned with the terrible, relentless machinery of war, bodies colliding against bodies, steel shrieking against steel, the ground trembling beneath the weight of charging horses and falling men. Tarhan moved through the carnage like a phantom conjured from the nightmares of the enemy, his blade singing through the air with a precision that was almost supernatural, each stroke finding its mark with devastating accuracy, severing limbs, splitting shields, and sending the soldiers of Daimir Khan sprawling into the blood-soaked mud. He fought not with the wild, reckless abandon of a man consumed by rage, but with the cold, calculated fury of a warrior who understood that every movement, every parry, every thrust was a prayer offered upon the altar of justice, a sacred act of devotion to the Sultan who had entrusted him with his life. An arrow whistled from the darkness, aimed directly at Arhan Sahib's exposed back. But Tarhan, whose eyes seemed to see in every direction simultaneously, spun on his heel and caught the shaft in mid-flight, snapping it in half with a single, contemptuous flick of his wrist before hurling himself back into the fray, cutting down the archer who had dared to take aim at the sovereign of the K. Beside him, Jarkata Sahib fought with the terrifying, unstoppable force of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. His grief for Boran transformed into a weapon more deadly than any blade, his war cry splitting the night air as he carved a path of destruction through the enemy ranks, searching, always searching, for the face of Shahanshah, the architect of his brother's murder. Arhan Sahib himself stood at the center of the storm, his killage raised high, its edge gleaming with the reflected light of the burning torches, and around him the K Alps formed a living, breathing wall of iron and faith, their shields locked, their swords ready, their voices rising in a thunderous chant that shook the very foundations of the earth. Abdul Rahman anchored the left flank, his massive frame an immovable bulwark against the surging tide of Daimir Khan's mercenaries, his great axe sweeping in devastating arcs that sent men flying through the air like broken dolls. Zarkin and Kuleds held the right, their twin blades moving in perfect, lethal synchronicity, a deadly dance of steel that left a trail of fallen bodies in their wake. Kilo commanded the rear guard, his voice hoarse from shouting orders, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of a flanking maneuver, his spear jabbing and thrusting at any shadow that dared to emerge from the darkness. And at the heart of it all, Arhan Sahib fought with the quiet, terrifying grace of a man who had been born to wield a sword, his movements fluid and economical, each strike delivered with the authority of a monarch and the precision of a master swordsman, his eyes never losing sight of the greater battlefield even as he dispatched one opponent after another with ruthless efficiency. Across the churning mass of fighting men, Daimir Khan raged like a wounded beast, his carefully constructed trap having collapsed around him like a house of cards in a storm. He had been so certain, so utterly, arrogantly convinced that the Ketchik mercenaries would serve as his executioners, that they would be the hammer that crushed the K upon the anvil of his ambition. But the betrayal of the Ketchik commander had shattered that illusion, and now Daimir Khan found himself fighting not from a position of overwhelming superiority, but from one of desperate, shrinking disadvantage. His forces, caught between the K Alps on one side and the Kechik warriors on the other, were being squeezed like grain between two millstones, the pressure mounting with every passing moment, the noose tightening with every fallen soldier. Mahmud fought beside him, his face a mask of panic, his sword arm growing heavy with exhaustion, and he screamed at Damir Khan over the din of battle, asking what they should do, demanding a plan, a strategy, anything that might reverse their rapidly deteriorating fortune. Damir Khan snarled in response, his pride refusing to acknowledge the reality of his situation, and he bellowed for his personal guard to form a wedge, to push through the K center and cut off the head of the snake by killing Orhan himself. The guard obeyed, a dozen of Damir Khan's most seasoned fighters forming a tight, disciplined formation and driving forward into the heart of the K lines, their swords and spears cutting a bloody path through the defenders. But Tarhan saw them coming. He always saw them coming. The elite swordsman broke away from his current engagement, dropping his shoulder to avoid a sweeping blow from a mercenary's mace, then rolling forward and coming up in a crouch directly in the path of the advancing wedge. His eyes met those of the lead attacker, a hulking giant of a man whose arms were as thick as tree trunks, and for a single, frozen heartbeat, time seemed to stop. Then Tarhan exploded into motion, his blade a blur of silver light, and the giant was falling before he even realized he had been struck, his body crumpling to the ground with a heavy, final thud. Tarhan did not pause, did not hesitate, his sword already seeking the next target, the next threat, his body a weapon of pure, honed instinct. And within the span of a few terrifying seconds, the wedge formation was broken, its members scattered and bleeding, their advance halted by a single, indomitable warrior who stood between them and his sultan like an immovable wall of living steel. Orhan Sahib, catching sight of Tarhan's defense, felt a surge of fierce pride. But there was no time for gratitude on the battlefield, only the grim, relentless calculus of survival, and he pressed forward, leading a counter-charge that drove deep into the enemy's left flank, his war cry a beacon that drew his Alps to him like moths to a flame. Meanwhile, Shahanshah had retreated to the rear of the battle, surrounded by a diminishing ring of bodyguards, his face twisted with a toxic mixture of fury and fear. He had orchestrated this entire confrontation from the shadows, pulling strings like a puppet master, manipulating Damir Khan and the Kechik with promises of gold, land, and power. And now, watching his grand design crumble before his eyes, the bitter taste of failure was like ashes on his tongue. He turned to Yakid, who stood beside him, his sword still clean, his eyes darting nervously at the encroaching chaos, and Shahanshah hissed at him, demanding to know why he was standing idle, why his blade was not yet wet with the blood of his former brothers. Yakid's face was pale, the veneer of bravado he had worn so easily in the safety of the shadows now stripped away by the raw, visceral reality of combat. He had imagined this moment so many times, had rehearsed his treachery in the privacy of his own mind, envisioning himself as a conquering hero. But now, faced with the screaming, bleeding, dying reality of war, he found that his courage was as hollow as his loyalty. He muttered something about waiting for the right moment, but Shahanshah saw through the excuse like sunlight through glass, and he grabbed Yakid by the collar of his armor, pulling him close, his breath hot against the traitor's face, snarling that if he did not fight, he would die here alongside the men he had betrayed, that there was no neutral ground in this valley, only the living and the dead, and that Yakid would need to choose which category he wished to inhabit by sunrise. Yakid, shoved roughly forward, stumbled into the fray, his sword finally drawn but his hands shaking so badly that the blade trembled like a leaf in a gale. He found himself face to face with a young K soldier, barely more than a boy, whose eyes widened with recognition and then narrowed with the burning, contemptuous fury of betrayal. The boy attacked with a ferocity that belied his youth, his sword crashing against Yakid's guard with the force of a falling hammer, and Yakid barely managed to parry the blow, his arms screaming in protest, his footing slipping on the blood-slick ground. They fought in a brutal, ugly exchange, stripped of all grace and artistry, two men locked in the most primal and desperate of struggles. And when Yakid finally landed a lucky blow that sent the boy sprawling, he stood over his fallen opponent, chest heaving, and saw not triumph in the act but the full, horrifying weight of his own damnation reflected in the dying light of the boy's eyes. Something inside Yakid cracked in that moment, a fracture that ran through his soul like a fissure in a great dam, and though the battle raged around him, though the screams and the steel continued their hellish chorus, Yakid stood frozen, staring at the blood on his hands, the blood of a brother he had once sworn to protect. And for the first time since he had chosen the path of treachery, the full, crushing magnitude of his sin pressed down upon him like the weight of the entire sky. Across the battlefield, Barhan Faladios led the Kechik reinforcements with the same fierce, uncompromising intensity that had made him a legend among the warriors of the frontier. He had spent the earlier hours of the night creeping through enemy lines, evading patrols, dodging sentries, and navigating the treacherous, maze-like network of ravines and hidden trails that crisscrossed the valley, all to reach the Kechik camp and deliver a message that would change the course of the battle. It had not been an easy task, for the Kechik were proud and suspicious, their trust not easily won, but Faladios had spoken to them not as a conqueror or a diplomat, but as a warrior, appealing to their sense of honor and their deep, ancestral hatred of those who used mercenaries as disposable pawns. He had shown them the letters, the secret correspondence between Shahanshah and Daimir Khan, which revealed in damning, undeniable detail that the conspirators intended to betray the Kechik after the Kei were destroyed, seizing their lands and absorbing their forces into their own army. The Kechik commander, a grizzled veteran whose face bore the scars of 100 battles, had read the letters in silence, his expression growing darker with each word, until finally he had crushed the parchment in his fist and sworn by his ancestors that his warriors would stand with the Kei, that they would exact their own vengeance upon the treacherous dogs who had sought to use them as tools of destruction. Now, as the battle raged, the Kechik fought with a fury born of wounded pride and righteous indignation, their swords and axes carving through the ranks of Daimir Khan's loyalists with devastating efficiency, turning the tide of the engagement irrevocably in Orhan's favor. The hours passed in a blur of blood and fire, the battle ebbing and flowing like a tide of human suffering, and as the first, faint hints of dawn began to paint the eastern horizon with strokes of pale, watery gold, the outcome became increasingly clear. Daimir Khan's forces were crumbling, their lines breaking apart under the relentless, dual assault of the Kei and the Kechik, their morale shattered by the betrayal of their supposed allies and the terrifying, implacable advance of Orhan's war machine. Pockets of resistance still flared here and there, isolated clusters of loyalists fighting with the desperate, cornered ferocity of men who knew that surrender would bring no mercy. But these were extinguished one by one, snuffed out like candle flames in a hurricane, as the combined forces swept through the valley with the unstoppable force of a rising flood. Daimir Khan, his personal guard reduced to a mere handful of bloodied, exhausted fighters, found himself being pushed inexorably backward, toward the narrow defile at the far end of the valley, the very same passage through which he had planned to retreat in triumph after the destruction of the Kei. Now it loomed before him not as an escape route but as a bottleneck, a trap of his own making, and as his remaining soldiers were cut down around him, he finally, reluctantly, painfully acknowledged the truth that his ambition had refused to accept, that this night had been his undoing, that the seeds of his destruction had been sown by his own hand, watered by his own arrogance, and brought to terrible, bitter harvest by the very forces he had sought to command. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the mountain ridge, painting the blood-soaked valley in shades of crimson and gold, Orhan Sahib stood upon the crest of a small hill, surveying the aftermath of the battle with eyes that were heavy with exhaustion but burning with an unquenchable, sovereign fire. The field before him was a testament to the terrible cost of war, littered with the fallen bodies of both friend and foe, their swords and shields scattered like the broken toys of some capricious, cruel giant. The moans of the wounded rose from the earth like a mournful hymn, blending with the distant calls of the carrion birds that were already circling overhead, their dark silhouettes cutting lazy, patient spirals against the brightening sky. Tarhin approached his sultan, his armor dented and stained with the blood of a dozen adversaries, his face a mask of controlled, disciplined calm despite the exhaustion that threatened to drag him to his knees. He reported that the main body of the enemy had been routed, that Damir Khan and a small contingent of survivors had managed to slip through the defile under cover of the final, desperate melee, but that pursuit parties had already been dispatched to track them down. Orhan nodded slowly, his jaw tight, his mind already racing ahead to the next move, the next battle, the next challenge that would inevitably arise from the ashes of this one. He asked about Shahanshah, and Tarhin's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl as he reported that the manipulative ruler had vanished during the height of the fighting, likely spirited away by his personal bodyguards through one of the many hidden trails that snaked through the forest. The knowledge that Shahanshah had escaped, that the puppet master remained at large while only his puppets had been destroyed, burned in Orhan's chest like a hot coal, but he forced the anger down, burying it beneath the iron discipline that had been forged into his soul by years of war and loss. There would be time for Shahanshah later. There was always time for justice. Jarkata Sahib approached next, his armor shattered in a dozen places, his left arm hanging limply at his side where a lucky sword thrust had pierced the gap in his vambrace, but his eyes were ablaze with a fierce, satisfied light that came not from the victory itself, but from the blood that still dripped from his blade, the blood of the men who had conspired to murder his brother. He reported that he had personally cut down 7 of Shahanshah's captains, men whose names had been on Boran's lips as he lay dying, men whose faces Jarkata had memorized and hunted through the chaos of battle with the single-minded, relentless determination of a wolf tracking wounded prey. But he admitted, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper, the one face he had sought above all others had eluded him. Shahanshah himself had slipped through his fingers, vanishing into the forest like smoke in the wind, and the knowledge that the architect of Boran's murder still drew breath was a poison that would continue to eat at Jarkata's soul until the debt was fully repaid. Orhan placed his hand on Jarkata's uninjured shoulder, meeting his eyes with a gaze that was equal parts empathy and iron resolve, and told him that the hunt was not over, that the wolf does not abandon the trail simply because the prey has gained a temporary lead, that they would find Shahanshah, they would corner him, and they would deliver the justice that Boran's soul demanded. Jarkata nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that was itself a silent oath, and then turned to oversee the collection of the fallen, for even in the aftermath of victory, the dead must be honored. Faladios, having dismounted from his war horse, walked among the battlefield with the quiet, contemplative air of a man who understood the true, terrible price of the victory they had won. He paused beside the body of a Kechik warrior who had fallen in the opening moments of the betrayal's reversal, a young man whose face was frozen in an expression of fierce, defiant courage, and knelt to close his eyes, whispering a prayer in the ancient tongue of the frontier peoples. Faladios knew, perhaps better than anyone, that this alliance with the Kechik was fragile, built upon the foundation of a shared enemy rather than a shared vision, and that the bonds forged in the heat of battle would need to be strengthened with diplomacy, generosity, and the careful, patient cultivation of trust if they were to endure beyond this single night. He sought out the Kechik commander, finding him sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, cleaning his sword with a bloodied rag, and the two men regarded each other with the wary, respectful silence of warriors who had fought side by side and found each other worthy. Faladios spoke first, thanking the commander for his courage, for the sacrifice of his men, and promising that Sultan Orhan would honor the Kechik's contribution with lands, trade rights, and the enduring friendship of the Ottoman state. The Kechik commander looked at him for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable, and then replied simply that he had not fought for promises or for land, but for the honor that Daimir Khan and Shahanshah had tried to strip from his people by using them as pawns, and that the true measure of Orhan's gratitude would be determined not by words spoken today, but by actions taken in the months and years to come. Faladios nodded, accepting the implicit challenge, and the two men clasped hands in a grip that was firm, honest, and laden with the weight of unspoken understanding. While the aftermath of battle played out in the valley, the drama in the forest continued to unfold with its own quiet, desperate intensity. Princess Esportia, still dazed from her fall, her head throbbing and her vision swimming, struggled to her feet and stumbled through the dense undergrowth, her torn garments catching on thorns and branches, her bare feet bleeding from the sharp stones that littered the forest floor. The vision of her father and of Orhan still lingered in her mind like the afterimage of a lightning strike, the two figures representing the two worlds, the two identities, the two futures that pulled at her with equal, agonizing force. She was the daughter of Andronikos, born into the splendor and the scheming of the Byzantine court, raised to be a chess piece in the grand game of empires, her marriage to Orhan designed not as a union of hearts but as a treaty sealed in flesh and blood. And yet, in her time among the Kei, she had glimpsed something she had never seen in the polished, perfumed halls of Constantinople, a raw, fierce, untamed devotion to something larger than oneself, a willingness to bleed and die not for power or for gold, but for the simple, profound belief that justice and honor were worth more than life itself. She had seen it in Orhan's eyes when he spoke of his people, in the way his voice softened when he mentioned his father's legacy, in the gentle, almost reverent way he held his sword before battle, as if the blade were not a weapon but a sacred trust passed down through generations. And she had felt it stirring within herself, a tiny, persistent flame that burned brighter with each passing day, a flame that the cold winds of the palace's hostility had not been able to extinguish, no matter how fiercely they blew. But the hostility had been real, and it had been relentless. Nilufer's sharp tongue, Ganka's barely concealed disdain, the whispered conversations that fell silent whenever she entered a room, the subtle, constant reminders that she was an outsider, a stranger, a potential enemy disguised as a bride. All of it had worn away at her spirit like water eroding stone, and the news of her father's increasingly desperate political maneuvers had been the final, crushing blow that broke the dam of her endurance. She had fled not out of disloyalty to Orhan, but out of a desperate, primal need to escape the suffocating pressure that was crushing her from all sides, to breathe, to think, to find some scrap of solid ground upon which to stand before she was swallowed entirely by the quicksand of other people's expectations and machinations. And now, lost in the dark forest, bleeding and alone, with the distant sounds of battle echoing through the trees like the thunder of a gathering storm, she realized with a clarity that was almost painful that there was no middle ground, no neutral territory, no safe harbor between the two worlds that claimed her. She would have to choose, and the choice, once made, would be irrevocable, a line drawn in the sand of history that could never be erased. She sank to her knees beside a small, gurgling stream, the moonlight dancing on the water's surface, and pressed her hands together in prayer, whispering words that were neither Greek nor Turkish, but the universal, wordless language of a soul crying out for guidance, for strength, for the wisdom to see the path that fate had laid before her feet. Fatima Hatun, meanwhile, pushed her horse to the very edge of endurance, riding through the night with the grim, implacable determination of a woman who had made a promise and intended to keep it, regardless of the cost. She had picked up Esportia's trail at the market, following the direction indicated by the horse merchant, and now she rode through the forest, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the princess, her hand resting on the hilt of her dagger, ready for any threat that might emerge from the shadows. She had volunteered for this mission not out of any particular affection for Esportia, for the two women had never been close, their interactions limited to the formal, carefully choreographed rituals of palace life, but out of a deep, unwavering loyalty to Arhan Sahib and to the House of Osman, a loyalty that transcended personal feelings and demanded that every member of the royal household be protected, sheltered, and brought safely home. Fatima understood, in a way that few others did, the terrible, impossible position in which Esportia had been placed, for she herself had once been an outsider, a woman whose worth was measured not by her own merits but by the strategic value of her bloodline, and she knew the silent, screaming agony of being reduced to a pawn in a game played by men who saw women not as souls but as symbols. She did not excuse Esportia's flight, for abandoning the palace without permission was a dangerous and reckless act that could have devastating political consequences, but she understood it, and in that understanding, she found the motivation to ride harder, to search more diligently, to push beyond the limits of her own exhaustion in the hope of finding the princess before the forest or the enemy found her first. The hours crawled by, marked only by the slow arc of the moon across the sky and the gradual deepening of the shadows, and as Fatima's horse began to falter, its flanks heaving with exhaustion, she caught sight of something that made her heart leap into her throat. There, beside a narrow stream, illuminated by a thin shaft of moonlight that pierced the canopy like a silver sword, knelt a solitary figure, her garments torn, her hair loose and wild, her hands pressed together in prayer. Fatima dismounted quickly, her movements silent and practiced, and approached the figure with the cautious, careful steps of a hunter approaching a wounded animal. As she drew closer, the figure's features came into focus, and Fatima recognized the pale, tear-streaked face of Princess Esportia, her beauty marred by the scratches and bruises of her ordeal, her eyes closed in fervent, desperate supplication. Fatima stopped a few paces away, her breath catching in her chest, and for a long moment she simply stood and watched, feeling the raw, unguarded vulnerability that radiated from the princess like heat from a dying ember. Then slowly, gently, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, calling the princess by name, telling her that she had come to bring her home. Esportia's eyes flew open, wide with surprise and fear, and she stared at Fatima with the wild, disoriented gaze of a deer caught in a torchlight. For a heartbeat, neither woman moved, the silence between them thick with the weight of all the things that had been left unsaid, all the wounds that had been inflicted, all the bridges that had been burned. Then Esportia's face crumpled, the mask of royal composure shattering like glass, and she whispered, her voice breaking on every syllable, that she did not know where she belonged, that she did not know who she was, that she felt as if she were drowning in a sea of duty and deception, and that there was no hand reaching down to pull her to the surface. Fatima knelt beside her, the cold water of the stream soaking the hem of her cloak, and took the princess's hands in her own, feeling the trembling that ran through them like the vibrations of a plucked bowstring, and told her that belonging was not a place or a people, but a choice, a decision made in the depths of one's own heart, and that no one, not Arhan, not Nilüfer, not Andronikos, not fate itself, could make that choice for her. The two women knelt together beside the stream, the moonlight wrapping around them like a shroud of silver, and in that quiet, sacred moment, something shifted between them. Some invisible barrier fell, and they were no longer the suspicious stranger and the dutiful servant of the house, but simply two women, lost in the vast, indifferent darkness of the world, holding onto each other because there was nothing else to hold onto. Back in the palace, the atmosphere had shifted from political tension to primal, visceral urgency, for Gonca Hatun's condition had deteriorated rapidly, her pains coming faster and more intensely, the intervals between them shrinking with terrifying speed. Malhun Hatun, her earlier anger forgotten in the face of this most ancient and immediate of crises, took command of the chamber with the same iron authority she wielded in the council room, directing the servants to bring hot water, clean linens, and the herbal preparations that the palace healers had assembled. Nilüfer knelt beside her sister, holding her hand, her face pale with a different kind of fear than she had ever known on the political stage, the fear of watching someone she loved suffer and being powerless to take the pain away. Ganka gripped Nilufer's hand with a strength that seemed impossible for her weakened state, her knuckles white, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps, and between the waves of pain, she whispered to her sister that she was afraid, that the child was coming too soon, that something did not feel right. Nilufer, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her cheeks, told her to be strong, that the women of the Kei did not surrender to fear, that their mother had borne them in a tent surrounded by the howling of wolves and the clash of swords, and that Ganka would do the same, here, in the safety of the palace, surrounded by those who loved her. Malhun, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, murmured prayers under her breath, her eyes flicking between Ganka's face and the door through which the healer would hopefully arrive at any moment. The night, it seemed, had decided to test the women of the Kei with every weapon in its arsenal, pitting them not just against the machinations of traitors and the flight of a desperate princess, but against the most fundamental and fearsome challenge of all, the fragile, dangerous miracle of bringing new life into a world that seemed, on this darkest of nights, determined to extinguish as much light as possible. And then, as if summoned by the collective prayer of every soul in the palace, the door burst open and the healer arrived, a wiry, ancient woman whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and whose eyes sparkled with the calm, confident intelligence of someone who had witnessed the miracle of birth 1,000 times and intended to witness it 1,000 more. She swept into the room like a force of nature, her weathered hands immediately assessing Ganka's condition, her voice low and soothing as she issued instructions to the servants, adjusting pillows, preparing remedies, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety around the laboring woman. Malhun stepped back, allowing the healer to work, but remained close, her hand resting on her prayer beads, her lips moving in constant, silent supplication. The hours that followed were an eternity compressed into a single, breathless night, filled with the sounds of Ganka's cries, the healer's calm commands, and the soft, murmured prayers of the women who had gathered to witness the newest thread being woven into the great, unending tapestry of the House of Osman. And as the battle raged in the distant valley and Fatima and Esportia huddled by the forest stream, here, in the warm, lamplight glow of the palace chamber, another kind of war was being fought. A war against the void, against the darkness, against the ever-present specter of loss that haunted every mother's heart. And it was a war that Ganka Hatun, daughter of the Kei, wife of a warrior and soon-to-be mother of a new generation, was determined to win. As the first, fragile light of dawn crept beneath the heavy curtains of the palace chamber, painting thin lines of gold across the stone floor, a sound rose from within the room that cut through the exhaustion and the fear like a blade of pure, crystalline hope. The high, thin, indignant wail of a newborn child, announcing its arrival in a world that was simultaneously beautiful and terrible, sacred and profane, waiting and merciless. Ganka, her face pale and drenched with sweat, her body trembling with the aftermath of the ordeal, opened her eyes and looked upon her child for the first time. And in that moment, all the politics, all the rivalries, all the schemes and betrayals and desperate midnight flights faded into insignificance before the overwhelming, transcendent reality of new life. Nilufer wept openly, her tears no longer those of fear, but of joy so profound it bordered on pain, and Malhun, the fierce, uncompromising matriarch of the Kei, allowed her own eyes to fill with tears, her iron composure finally cracking under the weight of this most powerful of emotions. She reached down, her wrinkled hands gentle as silk, and touched the child's forehead, whispering a prayer of protection, of blessing, of hope, a prayer that echoed the same words that had been whispered over every newborn child of the House of Osman, from the first days of the tribe to this moment. An unbroken chain of faith and love stretching back through the centuries like a river flowing toward the sea. And somewhere in the hazy, golden space between sleep and waking, Ganka smiled. A small, exhausted, triumphant smile, knowing that despite the darkness that surrounded them, despite the enemies that circled like wolves, despite the blood that stained the earth of the distant valley, life had triumphed, and the house of Osman had been blessed with a new soul to carry its legacy into the uncertain, unwritten future. The sun was well above the horizon when Arhan Sahib finally allowed himself to sit, his back resting against the rough bark of an ancient oak, his sword laid across his knees, his body aching with the accumulated punishment of hours of relentless combat. Tamir Boga had organized the camp with his characteristic efficiency, establishing a perimeter, setting up triage stations for the wounded, and dispatching scouts to track the remnants of Damir Khan's fleeing forces. Mustafa oversaw the collection and identification of the fallen, a grim, necessary task that he performed with a solemn, respectful dignity, ensuring that every warrior, friend or foe, was accorded the basic decency of a proper burial. Altadin Sahib had taken charge of the captured prisoners, a miserable, shell-shocked collection of mercenaries and turncoats whose eyes betrayed the hollow, numbing realization that their gamble had failed, and their future now rested entirely in the hands of the Sultan they had sought to destroy. Among them, conspicuously absent, was Yakid. The traitor had vanished during the final, chaotic minutes of the battle, slipping away in the confusion of the enemy's rout, and despite an intensive search of the battlefield and the surrounding area, no trace of him could be found. Tarhin reported the news to Arhan with a barely contained frustration, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with the knowledge that the most symbolic of their enemies had once again eluded justice. Arhan received the information in silence, his face betraying nothing, but within his chest, a cold, patient fury coiled like a snake, waiting, always waiting, for the moment when Yakid's path would cross his own once more, as he knew, with the absolute certainty of a man who had seen the patterns of fate unfold across 100 battlefields, that it inevitably would. The morning passed in a haze of exhaustion and grim productivity. The sounds of the camp, a subdued, purposeful murmur that stood in stark contrast to the deafening chaos of the night. Wounded men were treated, dead men were mourned, and the living gathered in small, quiet groups, sharing water and bread, and the simple, profound comfort of having survived another night in a world that offered no guarantees. Arhan summoned his commanders to a council of war, convening beneath the spreading branches of the great oak, the same tree against which he had rested, its ancient, gnarled roots serving as seats for the men who would decide the next chapter in this unfolding saga. Tarhin, Jarkata, Faladios, Tamir Boga, Abdul Rahman, Shamil, Zarkin, Kuleds, Killil, and the Ketchik commander all gathered, their faces drawn and lined with fatigue but their eyes sharp and focused, the eyes of men who understood that victory on the battlefield was merely the first step in a much longer, more complex campaign. Arhan spoke slowly, deliberately, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had learned that the most dangerous moments in war were not the battles themselves, but the quiet, treacherous interludes between them, when complacency and exhaustion conspired to undo all that courage and sacrifice had achieved. He laid out the situation with brutal honesty, acknowledging the scale of their victory, but refusing to sugarcoat the challenges that lay ahead. Damir Khan had escaped with a small but not insignificant force, and he would undoubtedly seek to rebuild his army, recruit new allies, and return to the fight, his hatred now deepened and sharpened by the humiliation of his defeat. Shahanshah remained at large, his network of spies and provocateurs still intact, his capacity for manipulation undimmed by the failure of this particular scheme. And Yakid, the traitor, the wound that refused to heal, was somewhere out there in the wilderness, a living, breathing symbol of betrayal whose continued existence undermined the very foundation of trust upon which the K state was built. But Arhan continued, his voice rising with a quiet, inexorable power that drew every eye and held every ear. They also possessed advantages that their enemies could not match. They had the loyalty of their people, earned not through fear or bribery, but through generations of just governance and shared sacrifice. They had the alliance of the Ketchik, forged in the fires of battle and tested in the crucible of betrayal, an alliance that, if properly nurtured, could become a cornerstone of their expanding state. They had the faith, the deep, unshakable belief that their cause was righteous, and that the Almighty, in His infinite wisdom and mercy, would guide their swords and shield their hearts against the darkness. And they had each other, brothers in arms bound by a loyalty that transcended blood, tribe, and self-interest, a brotherhood that no traitor could infiltrate and no enemy could destroy. Orhan paused, letting his words settle over the gathered commanders like a mantle of iron and silk. And then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper but carried the force of a thunderclap, he declared that the war was not over, that it would not be over until every traitor had been brought to justice, every occupied territory liberated, and every innocent soul that lived beneath the shadow of tyranny given the protection and the peace that was their God-given right. He told them that the road ahead would be long and bloodied, that there would be more nights like this one, more losses, more grief, more moments when despair would claw at their throats and whisper that surrender was the easier path. But he swore by the memory of his father, by the blood of Boran, by the sacred, eternal covenant between the house of Osman and the Almighty, that they would endure, they would prevail, and they would build a state so just, so powerful, and so enduring that the very mountains would bow before its glory, and the rivers would sing its praises until the end of time. The commanders received his words in a silence that was more eloquent than any cheer, a silence born of absolute conviction, and one by one, they drew their swords and held them aloft, the steel catching the morning light and transforming it into a constellation of blazing stars, a wordless oath that needed no translation, a promise made in steel and silence that they would follow this man, this sultan, this chosen vessel of divine purpose, through the gates of hell itself if he asked it of them. Tarhin was the first to speak, his voice rough and low, stating simply that his sword was Orhan's today, tomorrow, and forever. Jarkata followed, his injured arm forgotten, his eyes burning with the incandescent fire of a man who had found in his sultan the strength to transform his grief into a weapon. Faladios nodded once, a gesture that communicated volumes, his commitment requiring no elaboration. The Ketchik commander, last to raise his blade, did so with a deliberate, measured slowness that conveyed not hesitation but the gravity of his commitment, and when his sword joined the others, a murmur of approval rippled through the assembled warriors, a sound like the first, distant rumble of an approaching storm. The council concluded with the assignment of immediate tasks. Tarhin would lead a fast-riding pursuit force to track Damir Khan's retreating army, not to engage, but to observe, to map their route, to identify potential rallying points, and to report back. Faladios would consolidate the Ketchik alliance, traveling with their commander to the Ketchik heartlands to formalize the terms of their partnership and to ensure that the bond forged in battle would not fray in peacetime. Jarkata would take command of the valley's defenses, fortifying the positions they had won and preparing for any potential counterattack. Tamir Boga and Abdul Rahman would return to the palace with a contingent of guards, carrying news of the victory and ensuring the safety of the royal family. And Orhan himself would remain in the field, establishing a forward command post from which he could direct operations across the entire theater. His presence on the front lines, a living, breathing symbol of his commitment to the cause and a constant, looming threat to any enemy who dared to approach. As the camp began to move, the machine of war grinding back into motion with the slow, inexorable momentum of a boulder rolling downhill, Orhan walked alone to the edge of the clearing, where the forest began its ancient, whispering encroachment upon the field of battle. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the distant mountains, their peaks wreathed in clouds that glowed with the soft, golden light of the rising sun, and he thought of all the things he carried, the weight of the crown, the burden of the sword, the memory of the dead, the hopes of the living, the love of a wife he might never see again, and the faith that sustained him through the darkest of nights. He closed his eyes, feeling the warm sunlight on his face, and whispered a prayer, not the formal, ceremonial prayer of a sovereign, but the simple, heartfelt plea of a man who was tired and bloodied and afraid, but who refused with every fiber of his being to surrender to the darkness. He prayed for strength, for wisdom, for the souls of the departed, for the safety of Esportia and Fatima, for the health of Ganka and the child he did not yet know had been born, and for the courage to face whatever the coming days would bring. And as the prayer left his lips, carried away by the morning wind, he opened his eyes and saw, perched upon the lowest branch of the ancient oak, a single hawk, its feathers gleaming in the sunlight, its sharp, amber eyes fixed upon him with an intensity that seemed almost human. The bird regarded him for a long, still moment, and then, with a sudden, powerful beat of its wings, it launched itself into the sky, soaring upward in a wide, spiraling arc until it was nothing more than a dark speck against the infinite blue of the heavens. Orhan watched it go, and something stirred within him, a feeling that was not quite hope and not quite certainty, but something deeper and more ancient than either, a feeling that whispered in the quiet, secret language of the soul that the story was far from over, that the battles yet to come would be fiercer and more terrible than any he had yet endured, but that the hand of destiny was upon him, guiding his steps, sharpening his blade, and weaving the thread of his life into the great, magnificent, terrible tapestry of history, a tapestry that would be read and remembered long after the last stone of the last castle had crumbled into dust, and the last echo of the last war cry had faded into the eternal silence of the ages. And in the forest, Fatima helped Esportia onto her horse, steadying the princess with a firm, gentle hand, and the two women began the long, slow journey back to the palace, riding in silence through the dappled, shifting light of the morning forest, the shadows of the trees falling across their path like the bars of a cage or the stripes of a banner, depending on how one chose to see them. Esportia rode with her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the distant towers of the palace were just barely visible above the tree line, tiny and fragile against the vast, indifferent sky, and within her chest, the flame that Orhan's vision had rekindled still burned, small and uncertain, but alive, undeniably, stubbornly, miraculously alive, a flame that the winds of doubt and despair had not been able to extinguish, a flame that would either grow to illuminate the darkness or be smothered by the gathering storm. Only time, that most patient and most merciless of judges, would tell. And in the valley, the last of the campfires was being extinguished, the soldiers forming up into marching columns, the drums beginning their slow, steady beat, and the army of Sultan Orhan moved forward, into the unknown, into the unwritten, into the vast, terrifying, glorious uncertainty of a future that was being forged, word by word, blow by blow, prayer by prayer, in the blood and fire and faith of men and women who refused to let the darkness win, who stood upon the crumbling edge of history and declared, with the full, thundering force of their collective will, that the light would not go out, that the sword would not be sheathed, that the story would continue, chapter after relentless, magnificent chapter, until the last page was written and the final truth was revealed, a truth that the mountains knew, that the rivers whispered, that the stars proclaimed in their slow, silent revolution across the heavens, that justice, however long it takes, however many sacrifices it demands, however dark the night through which it must travel, will always, always, always find its way home. The prisoner was brought into the camp as the last embers of twilight surrendered to the absolute dominion of night, and the silence that greeted Yakid's arrival was more devastating than any jeering crowd or howling mob could ever have been. A silence born not of indifference, but of a contempt so deep, so thorough, so utterly complete that it had transcended the need for verbal expression, and settled instead into the marrow of every man who watched the traitor stumble past, his wrists bound, his head bowed, his feet dragging through the dirt like a man already dead, who had simply not yet received the courtesy of being informed. The soldiers who lined the path did not spit, did not curse, did not raise their fists or hurl stones. They simply turned their backs, one by one, a slow, deliberate, devastating cascade of rejection that rippled through the ranks like a wave retreating from a poisoned shore. Each turned back, a door being closed, a bond being severed, a final, irrevocable declaration that the man who walked among them was no longer one of them, had forfeited his claim to brotherhood, to honor, to the basic human dignity of being acknowledged by those he had betrayed. Yakid felt every turned back like a blade between his ribs, each one driving deeper than the last, and by the time Tarhan deposited him in the makeshift holding area, a shallow pit ringed with sharpened stakes and guarded by 4 of the most fearsome Alps in the company, the traitor was a hollowed-out shell of the man he had once been, his eyes vacant, his spirit crushed beneath the accumulated weight of his choices, a living monument to the terrible, inescapable truth that there are some prices that cannot be paid with gold or blood or tears, some debts that compound with every heartbeat, until the interest alone is sufficient to consume a man's entire existence and leave nothing behind but the fatting echo of a name that would be spoken, from this day forward, only as a warning. Damir Khan, by contrast, was treated with the cold, formal courtesy that was owed to a defeated commander of rank. His weapons confiscated but his person unharmed, his quarters a small but adequate tent set apart from the main camp, and guarded not by common soldiers but by officers, a distinction that was itself a message, communicating to all who observed it that the Ottoman state drew a clear, principled line between the treatment of enemies and the treatment of traitors, between those who had fought openly under their own banner, and those who had stabbed their brothers in the back under cover of false oaths and feigned loyalty. Damir Khan sat in his tent, his armor stripped away, his face gaunt and gray in the flickering candlelight, and he stared at the canvas wall with the empty, unfocused gaze of a man who was replaying the final hours of his freedom in an endless, torturous loop, searching for the moment where it all went wrong, the decision, the word, the gesture that had set him on the path to this ignominious end. He knew, with the bitter clarity of hindsight, that the answer was not a single moment but 1,000 moments, 1,000 small compromises, 1,000 tiny betrayals of principle and honor that had accumulated over the years like grains of sand in an hourglass, each one seemingly insignificant in isolation, but together forming a mass so heavy, so dense, so utterly immovable that it had become the foundation upon which his entire life was built. A foundation of sand that the first serious storm had washed away, leaving him standing on nothing, supported by nothing, reaching for something that was no longer there and perhaps had never been there at all. Orhan Sahib did not visit either prisoner that night. Instead, he retreated to his tent, dismissed his attendants, and sat alone in the darkness for a long, unmeasured stretch of time, his sword across his knees, his eyes closed, his mind working through the events of the day with the slow, methodical thoroughness of a craftsman examining his work for flaws. The parley at Kara Hissar had been a success in the narrowest, most immediate sense. Damir Khan had surrendered, Yakid had been captured, and the fortress had been secured without the loss of a single Ottoman life. But Orhan knew, with the unsentimental pragmatism that was the hallmark of his leadership, that the victory was incomplete, a chapter concluded but a story far from finished. Shahanshah remained at large, and as long as that cunning, resourceful, deeply dangerous man drew breath, the Ottoman state would never be truly secure. Every peace would be temporary, every alliance suspect, every moment of calm merely the eye of a storm that was gathering strength for its next assault. The spider's web had been torn, but the spider itself had escaped, and Orhan understood from long and bitter experience that a spider without a web is not helpless but merely inconvenienced, that it will spin again, patiently, methodically, with the cold, mechanical persistence of a creature that has no other purpose, no other skill, no other reason for existence than the construction of traps for the unwary. The dispatch from the palace had arrived during Orhan's absence at Kara Hissar, and it sat now on the table beside his candle, its seal broken, its contents read and reread until every word was burned into his memory. Malhun's handwriting was as firm and as precise as her character, each letter formed with the disciplined, unwavering hand of a woman who viewed even penmanship as an expression of authority, and the news she conveyed was a tapestry woven from threads of joy and anxiety in equal measure. Ganka had given birth to a son, healthy and strong, with lungs powerful enough to shake the rafters and a grip that had already left bruises on his mother's fingers. The household was in a state of cautious celebration, the arrival of a new life providing a desperately needed counterpoint to the grief and tension that had dominated the palace for weeks. But Malhun was careful to temper the good news with a frank assessment of the domestic situation. Asportia had returned safely, thanks to Fatima's intervention, and was resting in her chambers, her physical injuries minor but her emotional state fragile and uncertain. The relationship between Nilüfer and Asportia remained strained, despite the tentative, grudging détente that had been established in the wake of the princess's return, and Malhun warned that the underlying tensions had not been resolved but merely suppressed, like embers covered with ash that could reignite at any moment if not properly addressed. She urged her sultan to return as soon as military necessity permitted, not just for the sake of his family but for the sake of the state, because the palace, for all its walls and guards and ceremonial splendor, was also a political arena in which the balance of power was maintained not by force but by the constant, careful, exhausting exercise of personal authority. And in the Sultan's absence, that balance was precarious, maintained only by Malhun's iron will and the grudging, conditional compliance of women who were, each in her own way, as formidable and as dangerous as any warrior on the battlefield. Orhan read the dispatch again, his fingers tracing the words as if he could draw from the parchment some physical connection to the wife and the family he had not seen in weeks, and when he reached the passage about the newborn, he paused, his hand hovering over the words, a smile touching his lips for the first time in longer than he could remember. A son. The house of Osman had been blessed with a new son, a child who would carry the bloodline forward into the uncharted waters of the future, a living, breathing declaration that no matter how much blood was spilled and how many tears were shed, the river of life continued to flow, unstoppable, irrepressible, eternal. He whispered a prayer for the child, invoking the protection of the Almighty upon this tiny, innocent soul that had entered the world in the midst of a storm, and he made a silent vow, spoken to no one but himself and the God who heard all vows, that he would build for this child, and for all the children of his nation, a world in which justice was not an aspiration but a reality, in which the strong protected the weak, and the wise guided the foolish, and the sword was drawn only in defense of those who could not defend themselves. It was a vow he had made before, many times in many different forms, but each time he made it, it felt new, felt fresh, felt as urgent and as vital as if it were being spoken for the first time, because the world had a way of testing such vows, of grinding them down with the relentless abrasion of compromise and expediency, and the thousand small surrenders that practical governance demanded. And the only way to keep a vow alive was to renew it constantly, to polish it with repetition, to sharpen it with remembrance, to carry it before oneself like a torch in the darkness, illuminating the path and holding the shadows at bay. The following morning brought the departure of Faladios and the Keçik commander, who rode out together at the head of a mixed escort of Ottoman and Keçik warriors, their horses laden with the gifts and the diplomatic dispatches that would formalize the alliance between the two peoples. Faladios, whose ability to navigate the treacherous waters of intertribal diplomacy was matched only by his ferocity on the battlefield, had spent the previous evening in deep, intense conversation with the Keçik commander, hammering out the preliminary terms of an agreement that would grant the Keçik autonomy over their traditional lands in exchange for military cooperation, and the recognition of Ottoman sovereignty in matters of foreign policy and collective defense. The negotiations had been difficult, at times contentious, the Kechik commander pushing back fiercely on any provision that he perceived as an infringement on his people's independence, and Faladios matching him point for point with the patient, persuasive tenacity of a man who understood that the best deals were not those in which one side dominated the other, but those in which both sides walked away feeling that they had gained something of genuine value. The final draft, while still preliminary, represented a remarkable achievement, a framework for cooperation between two peoples who had been adversaries for generations, united now by the shared threat of a common enemy and the fragile, tentative, but nonetheless real possibility of mutual benefit. As they rode out, Faladios turned in his saddle and looked back at the camp, catching Orhan's eye across the distance, and the two men exchanged a nod that communicated volumes, a silent acknowledgment of the road that lay ahead, the challenges that remained, and the unshakable, unconditional trust that bound them together across the gulf of rank and temperament and personal history. With the departure of Faladios, the camp entered a period of intense, focused activity as Orhan prepared for the return to the capital, a journey that would involve not just the physical transportation of an army and its prisoners, but the careful, strategic orchestration of a political event. The public presentation of victory to a people who desperately needed the reassurance that their sultan was in control, and that the threats to their security were being systematically identified and neutralized. Orhan understood that perception, in politics, was as important as reality, and that the manner in which the victory was communicated to the public would shape their understanding of the conflict, their confidence in the government, and their willingness to endure the continued sacrifices that the ongoing struggle would inevitably demand. He summoned Shamil, and together they drafted a series of proclamations that would be distributed throughout the Ottoman territories, announcing the defeat of the conspirators, the capture of Damir Khan and Yakid, and the establishment of the alliance with the Kechik, framed not as a military triumph, but as a vindication of justice, a demonstration that the Ottoman state, under the guidance of its sultan and the protection of the Almighty, possessed both the strength to defend itself and the wisdom to build alliances, both the courage to fight and the magnanimity to offer mercy, both the resolve to punish treachery and the generosity to reward loyalty. The proclamations were written in the grand, ornate style that was customary for official documents, their language rich with religious invocations, historical allusions, and the rhythmic, almost musical cadences that gave Ottoman state prose its distinctive, authoritative tone. And when they were completed, sealed, and dispatched with a corps of fast riders to every corner of the realm, Orhan felt, for the first time in weeks, a sense of forward momentum, a feeling that the machine of state was functioning as it should, responding to challenges, adapting to circumstances, and moving, however slowly, however painfully, toward the vision of order and justice that was the guiding star of his reign. But even as the wheels of governance turned, the personal dimensions of the crisis continued to demand attention, for the human heart does not operate according to the tidy, logical principles of statecraft, and the wounds that had been inflicted upon the souls of those closest to Orhan were not the kind that could be healed by proclamations or treaties or military victories. Jarkata Sahib, who had thrown himself into the work of fortifying the valley with the manic, consuming intensity of a man trying to outrun his own grief, was beginning to show the cracks in his armor that his comrades had feared since the moment of Boran's death. He worked from dawn until well past midnight, refusing to eat, refusing to rest, driving himself and his men to the very limits of their endurance. And when anyone approached him with words of concern or sympathy, he deflected them with a snarled dismissal that was equal parts rage and terror, the response of a man who knew that if he stopped moving, even for a moment, the grief would catch up with him and drag him down into a darkness from which he might never emerge. Orhan saw this, recognized it for what it was, and knew that he needed to intervene before Jarkata's self-destruction became irrevocable. But he also knew that the intervention could not be direct, could not be the heavy-handed, authoritative command of a sultan ordering a subordinate to stand down, because Jarkata's pain was not a military problem to be solved but a human catastrophe to be navigated, and the only approach that had any chance of success was the approach of a brother, a friend, a fellow traveler on the long, dark road of loss. He found Jarkata alone at the furthest outpost of the fortification works, a lonely, windswept ridge from which the entire valley could be observed, the stars wheeling overhead in their slow, majestic arc, and the campfires of the army glittering below like a mirror of the heavens. Jarkata was sitting on a rock, his sword across his knees, his eyes fixed on the distant darkness beyond the valley, his face a mask of stone that had been carved by a sculptor who knew nothing of softness or mercy or peace. Orhan sat beside him without speaking, lowering himself onto the cold, hard rock with the slow, careful movements of a man whose body was protesting the accumulated abuse of the past weeks. And for a long time, the two men simply sat in silence, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the dry grass and the distant, mournful cry of an owl hunting in the darkness below. It was Jarkata who spoke first, his voice a low, cracked rumble that sounded as if it were being dragged from the bottom of a well. He said that he had been dreaming of Boran, that every night when he closed his eyes, he saw his brother's face, not the face of the dead man on the cold ground of the valley, but the face of the young man he had known decades ago, the laughing, reckless, impossibly brave boy who had followed him into his first battle with a wooden sword strapped to his belt, because his real sword had not yet been forged, and who had fought beside him through every campaign, every siege, every desperate, bloody, glorious chapter of a life spent in the service of the house of Osman. He said that in the dream, Boran always spoke to him, always said the same thing, and Jarkata's voice broke as he repeated the words, a simple, devastating sentence that cut through the night air like a blade through silk, the words, "Do not let my death make you forget how to live." Orhan did not respond immediately. He sat with the words, felt their weight, allowed them to settle into his own heart where they joined the chorus of similar whispers, the voices of his own dead, his father, his mentors, the countless friends and allies who had fallen along the way, and whose absence was a constant, dull ache that he had learned to carry the way a soldier learns to carry his armor, not because it is comfortable but because the alternative, setting it down, is worse. And then he spoke, his voice quiet but steady, telling Jarkata that Boran was right, that the dead see more clearly than the living because they have been stripped of the illusions that cloud mortal vision, the illusion of control, the illusion of permanence, the illusion that if we just fight hard enough, run fast enough, work long enough, we can outpace the one enemy that no sword can defeat and no fortress can withstand. He told Jarkata that grief was not a weakness to be conquered but a testament to love, that a man who does not grieve has not truly loved, and that the tears he refused to shed were not signs of strength, but symptoms of a wound that was festering beneath the surface, poisoning his blood, corroding his spirit, and threatening to destroy from within what no enemy had been able to destroy from without. He told him that Boran's legacy was not just the battles he had won or the enemies he had slain, but the love he had given, and the joy he had brought and the laughter that had echoed through the camps on 1,000 nights just like this one, and that the greatest dishonor they could do to that legacy was not to lose a battle or surrender a fortress, but to allow the darkness of grief to extinguish the light that Boran had spent his entire life kindling in the hearts of those around him. Jarkata listened, and as Orhan's words washed over him, the mask began to crack, the stone began to crumble, and the tears that he had been holding back since the moment he had knelt beside his brother's body finally broke free, not in a gentle, controlled release, but in a great, wrenching, shuddering torrent that shook his massive frame like an earthquake and sent him folding forward, his forehead pressed against his knees, his hands clutching the fabric of his trousers, as if he were trying to hold himself together through sheer physical force. Orhan put his arm around the grieving warrior's shoulders, holding him as the storm raged, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say, because the only thing that a man can offer another man in the deepest, darkest moments of his grief is his presence, the simple, wordless assurance that he is not alone, that someone is sitting beside him in the darkness, sharing the weight, bearing the burden, waiting with him for the dawn that will come, that always comes, no matter how long and how terrible the night. They sat there together on the cold, windswept ridge, the sultan and the warrior, the leader and the led, two men bound not by the chains of rank and duty but by the deeper, more enduring bonds of shared loss and mutual love. And as the hours passed and the stars traced their slow, inevitable arcs across the sky, something shifted between them. Some invisible weight was redistributed, some balance restored, and when the first gray light of dawn began to seep over the eastern mountains, Jarkata raised his head, wiped his eyes with the back of his scarred, calloused hand, and looked at his sultan with an expression that was no longer the blank, terrifying mask of suppressed grief, but something else entirely. Something that was tired and battered and raw, but also unmistakably human, alive, present. A man who had walked into the valley of the shadow and had emerged not unscathed, never unscathed, but standing, breathing, ready to face whatever came next with the knowledge that he was not carrying his burden alone. The army broke camp the following day. The tents struck, the fires extinguished, the fortifications left in the hands of a garrison under Kilil's command, and the long column of soldiers, horses, wagons, and prisoners began the slow, winding descent from the valley toward the plain that led to the capital. The journey would take 3 days, perhaps 4 if the weather turned, and Orhan used the time wisely, riding up and down the column, conferring with his commanders, inspecting the condition of his troops, and ensuring that every detail of the army's organization and discipline was maintained to the highest standard, because he knew that their arrival at the capital would be observed by thousands of eyes, friendly and hostile alike, and that the impression they made, the image of strength, unity, and purpose that they projected, would echo through the political landscape for months to come, shaping alliances, deterring enemies, and reinforcing the legitimacy of the Ottoman state in the minds of a populace that was hungry for stability and desperate for leadership they could believe in. Tarhan rode at the Sultan's side, as always, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his sword, his vigilance undiminished by the exhaustion that had etched deep lines into his face and turned his normally sharp, alert eyes into red-rimmed, shadowed pools of determination. Abdul Rahman commanded the rear guard, his great axe slung across his back, his massive frame swaying with the rhythm of his horse's gait, and Zarkin and Kuleds flanked the prisoner wagon, their twin blades gleaming at their hips, their expressions conveying to anyone who might be considering a rescue attempt that such an endeavor would be the last decision they ever made. On the second day of the march, a rider appeared on the horizon, galloping toward the column at full speed, a plume of dust rising behind him like the tail of a comet. The outriders intercepted him, verified his identity, and escorted him directly to the Sultan, and when the rider dismounted and knelt before Orhan, his face flushed and his breath coming in great, heaving gasps, he carried in his saddlebag a dispatch that bore the seal of Faladio's. Orhan broke the seal and read the dispatch in silence, his expression giving nothing away to the watching soldiers, but those who knew him well, Tarhan, Jarkata, Shamil, could see the subtle tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes, the infinitesimal shift in his posture that indicated the absorption of information that was significant, complex, and potentially dangerous. When he had finished reading, he folded the dispatch carefully, tucked it into the inner pocket of his cloak, and resumed the march without comment. But that evening, when the army made camp on the banks of a shallow, fast-flowing river, he summoned his inner circle to his tent and shared the contents of the dispatch with the gravity and the precision of a surgeon describing a delicate, high-risk operation. Faladios reported that his negotiations with the Kechik had concluded successfully, the alliance formalized, the terms agreed, the oath sworn, and the documents sealed, but that in the course of his diplomatic mission, he had uncovered intelligence of the most disturbing and consequential nature. Shahanshah, it appeared, had not merely fled the battlefield and gone to ground. He had traveled with remarkable speed and audacity to the court of a powerful neighboring state, where he had been granted an audience with the ruler, and had presented his case for a grand alliance against the Ottomans, painting Orhan as an aggressive, expansionist tyrant whose unchecked ambitions threatened the stability and sovereignty of every independent state in the region. The neighboring ruler, who had his own reasons for viewing the rise of Ottoman power with suspicion and alarm, had listened with interest, had asked probing, detailed questions about the Ottoman military capabilities and strategic intentions, and had concluded the audience with a carefully worded statement that stopped short of a formal commitment, but left the door wide open for future cooperation. Faladios had obtained this information through a network of informants that he had cultivated over years of patient, meticulous intelligence work, and while the details were still fragmentary and some aspects of the report remained unconfirmed, the overall picture was clear enough to warrant immediate attention and urgent strategic recalibration. The tent was silent for a long moment after Orhan finished speaking, the commanders processing the implications of the intelligence with the focused, analytical intensity of men whose survival depended on their ability to see the shape of threats before those threats materialized into physical form. Tarhan spoke first, his voice flat and hard, stating the obvious, that Shahanshah was building a coalition, assembling the scattered, disparate enemies of the Ottoman state into a unified force that would be far more dangerous than any single adversary. Abdul Rahman growled his agreement, adding that they should have killed the snake when they had the chance, that mercy shown to a viper was merely an invitation for another bite. Jarkata, his face still bearing the marks of his recent emotional reckoning, but his eyes clear and focused, observed that the neighboring ruler's interest in Shahanshah's proposal was not surprising, that the rapid expansion of Ottoman power had inevitably generated fear and resentment among the established states of the region, and that it was only a matter of time before those fears crystallized into a coordinated response. Shamil, ever the strategist, noted that the intelligence, while concerning, also presented opportunities, that the knowledge of Shahanshah's movements and intentions gave them a window, narrow but real, in which to take preemptive action, either by disrupting the nascent alliance through their own diplomatic efforts or by positioning their forces to meet the threat before it fully materialized. Orhan listened to each perspective, weighing it, testing it against his own analysis, and then spoke in the measured, deliberate cadence that his commanders had learned to associate with decisions of the highest consequence. He acknowledged the severity of the threat, agreed that Shahanshah's diplomatic offensive represented a potentially existential challenge to the Ottoman state, and conceded that the temptation to respond with immediate, aggressive military action was almost overwhelming. But he cautioned against haste, reminding his commanders that the very qualities that had made them victorious in the valley, patience, discipline, unity, and the willingness to see the larger picture beyond the immediate crisis, were the qualities that would be needed now more than ever. A rash military strike against a neighboring state, undertaken without proper preparation or diplomatic cover, would only confirm the narrative that Shahanshah was spinning, that the Ottomans were aggressors, conquerors, a threat to the established order that must be contained by force. Instead, Orhan proposed a multi-pronged strategy that combined military preparedness with diplomatic outreach, intelligence operations, and the strategic use of the captured prisoners, particularly Damir Khan, whose testimony, if properly extracted and presented, could expose Shahanshah's treachery and undermine his credibility in the courts where he was seeking asylum and support. He assigned tasks with his characteristic clarity and precision, dispatching Tarhan to establish a covert observation post near the border of the neighboring state, ordering Abdul Rahman to begin the discreet fortification of the frontier settlements, directing Shamil to draft diplomatic letters to the rulers of the neutral states in the region, offering reassurances, proposing trade agreements, and subtly communicating the message that the Ottoman state sought partnership, not domination, and that those who aligned themselves with the proven treachery of Shahanshah would find themselves on the wrong side of history. The army reached the outskirts of the capital on the afternoon of the fourth day, the towers and minarets of the city rising from the plain like the masts of a great ship anchored in a sea of golden wheat. The news of their approach had preceded them, carried by the fast riders who had been dispatched with the proclamations, and the road into the city was lined with thousands of people, men, women, and children who had turned out to witness the return of their sultan and the public display of the captured traitors. The crowd was a living, breathing entity, its mood shifting and rippling like the surface of a lake disturbed by 1,000 stones, waves of cheering and shouting rolling through the masses as the vanguard appeared, the imperial banner flying at the head of the column, its green and gold fabric snapping in the afternoon breeze like a living, defiant creature. Orhan rode at the center of the column, flanked by Tarhin and Jarkata, his bearing erect, his face composed, his eyes sweeping the crowd with the calm, watchful gaze of a sovereign who understood that this moment was not a celebration but a demonstration, a carefully orchestrated display of power and justice that would communicate to every citizen, every merchant, every foreign ambassador, every potential ally and every potential enemy, that the Ottoman state was intact, its leadership was strong, its army was victorious, and its commitment to justice was absolute and unwavering. The prisoner wagon rolled through the streets behind the main body of the column, and as it passed, the crowd's mood shifted from celebration to something darker, more primal, a low, ominous murmur that built in intensity until it became a roar, a wall of sound that crashed against the wagon like a wave against a cliff, the voices of thousands of people expressing, in the raw, unfiltered language of collective emotion, their rage at the betrayal that had cost the lives of their husbands, their fathers, their sons, their brothers. Yakid cowered in the corner of the wagon, his head buried in his arms, his body shaking with the convulsive, uncontrollable tremors of a man who was drowning in the hatred of those he had wronged. Damir Khan, by contrast, sat upright, his chin raised, his eyes forward, maintaining to the very last the hollow, brittle dignity of a man whose pride was the only thing he had left, a suit of armor made of nothing but stubborn, self-destructive refusal to acknowledge the magnitude of his defeat. The procession wound through the city, past the great mosque, past the market square, past the barracks and the armories and the workshops, and finally through the gates of the palace itself, where Malhun Hatun stood on the steps of the grand entrance, her back straight, her eyes bright, her presence a pillar of strength and authority that anchored the entire scene with the weight of her formidable personality. Orhan dismounted and climbed the steps to where his wife stood, and for a single, breathless moment, the public facade fell away, and there were only two people, a man and a woman, separated for weeks by the demands of duty and the cruelties of war, reunited now in the golden, slanting light of a late afternoon that seemed, for all its beauty, inadequate to the task of illuminating the depth and the complexity of what passed between them in that look, that long, searching, hungry, grateful, terrified, loving look that said everything that words could never say and that communicated, in the silent, ancient language of two souls that had been bound together by fate and forged together by suffering, that they were still here, still standing, still fighting, still loving, despite everything, because of everything, in defiance of everything that had tried to break them apart. And then the moment passed, the facade was restored, and the Sultan and his consort turned together to face the crowd that had gathered in the courtyard, presenting a united front to a world that was watching, waiting, judging, and wondering what would come next. And what came next was not peace. What came next was not rest. What came next was the long, exhausting, unglamorous work of governance, the trials and the treaties and the tax reforms and the diplomatic dispatches, and the endless, grinding, necessary labor of building a state from the raw materials of human courage and human folly, a state that would be tested again and again, by enemies from without and by divisions from within, by the ambitions of rivals and the schemes of traitors and the simple, crushing, everyday challenges of feeding a people, defending a border, educating a generation, and holding together a mosaic of cultures, languages, and faiths that was simultaneously the Ottoman state's greatest strength and its most persistent vulnerability. And somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers, beyond the reach of the Sultan's scouts and the range of his armies, Shahanshah sat in a foreign court, his spider's mind weaving its endless, patient web, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the minarets of the Ottoman capital rose like a challenge against the sky. And he whispered to himself, in a voice that was soft and cold and terrible in its absolute, unwavering certainty, that the game was not over, that it was never over, that the board had been reset and the pieces were being moved into position, and that the next move, when it came, would be devastating, unexpected, and impossible to counter. And the wind, which had carried the screams of the battlefield and the prayers of the faithful, and the cries of the newborn and the whispered confessions of the broken, carried his words too, scattering them across the land like seeds of a poison that would take root in the cracks and the crevices and the hidden, forgotten places where hatred and resentment and the hunger for revenge lay dormant, waiting, always waiting, for the season of darkness to return and the cycle to begin again, as it always had, as it always would, until the final trumpet sounded and the last account was settled, and the great, terrible, magnificent story of humanity reached its ultimate, unknowable conclusion in the hands of the one who had written its beginning and who alone knew, in the infinite depths of his wisdom and his mercy, how it would end.